For 23 years, Sophie Bennett made herself invisible. No one remembered her face. No one knew her name. Then one night, she did the one thing she swore she would never do. She made herself seen, and the most powerful man in Chicago noticed. What happened next put her grandmother, her freedom, and her heart all at risk. This channel tells stories for women who believe that love should be fierce, loyalty should be earned, and even the quietest person in the room can change everything. Today's lesson: invisibility feels safe, but being truly seen is the only way to truly live. If Sophie's story speaks to you, hit that like button. Share this with a friend who needs to hear it and subscribe. We have so many more stories waiting for you.
The Onyx Room was more than just a restaurant. It was a fortress masquerading as fine dining. Perched high on Chicago's Gold Coast, it was the place where the city's most powerful people came to wash away their sins with expensive wine. The chandeliers hanging from the ceiling were worth more than a family home. The heavy velvet curtains could swallow a gunshot, and the servers were trained to be utterly unnoticeable. Sophie Bennett was the master of being invisible. At 23, Sophie was a ghost in a black uniform. She had perfected the silent step, moving without a single floorboard creaking or a piece of silverware rattling. She was the woman who took your jacket and vanished from your memory 5 seconds later, the one who topped off your glass before you noticed it was low. Tonight, though, the kitchen air was thick with a strange pressure, the kind that comes right before a storm. "He's on his way," Mr. Holloway, the manager, whispered, dabbing sweat from his shiny scalp. Normally a man of perfect composure, tonight he looked like he was about to be sick. "Table 1, the private booth. I want those linens ironed a second time. I want the forks and knives polished so bright they hurt your eyes. Do you understand me?" The entire kitchen erupted into controlled chaos. Head chefs were shouting orders, assistant chefs were shaking. Sophie just stood near the espresso maker, polishing a single spoon, feeling her heart pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "Who is it?" asked Chloe, a new hostess whose eyeliner was as heavy as her survival instincts were light. "Moretti," a cook grumbled, his eyes fixed on the onions he was chopping. Dominic Moretti. The name landed in the room like a block of concrete. Dominic Moretti. The newspapers described him as a logistics expert. The streets knew him as the undisputed king of Chicago. He grabbed the reins of the family enterprise 3 years ago after his father was gunned down on Wacker Drive. In the time since, crime in his territories had mysteriously plunged, mainly because any criminal not on his payroll had a tendency to disappear. He was 32, brutally handsome, and known for his chilling silence. If Moretti was speaking, you had nothing to worry about. If he fell silent, you were already a ghost. "He's bringing a guest," Holloway said sharply, pointing a finger at Sophie. "Bennett, you are on water and bread duty for the main dining room. You will not go near table 1. I'm assigning Pierre to that table. Pierre knows how to handle difficult clientele." Sophie simply nodded, keeping her gaze down. "Yes, sir." The last place she wanted to be was near table 1. She just hoped to get through her shift, gather her tips, and return to her quiet apartment in Rogers Park. Her rent was due, and her grandmother's medical bills were stacking up on her kitchen table like a mountain of snow. She did not have room in her life for trouble. But trouble often seeks out the quietest people. By 8 o'clock, the restaurant was a low buzz of activity. The lights were turned down to a warm amber hue. Sophie glided between the tables, pouring sparkling water, skillfully avoiding the wandering hands of intoxicated stockbrokers and keeping her eyes on the floor. Then, the main doors swung open. It was not a typical arrival. The restaurant's pleasant hum did not simply quiet down. It was violently cut off. Conversations died. Forks froze in midair. Dominic Moretti had entered the building. He was much taller than the grainy photos in the papers suggested. He wore a dark gray suit that seemed molded to his body, perfectly designed to conceal the firearm everyone knew he carried. His dark hair was slicked back, revealing a face with sharp, unforgiving angles and zero emotion. His eyes scanned the room just once, like a wolf testing the air, before he shifted his focus. He was not with a bodyguard or a beautiful woman. He was carefully offering his arm to an old lady. She was a frail thing, dressed in a simple black dress with a lace collar straight out of the 1950s. Her hair was stark white, tied in a tight bun. Her hand clutched Dominic's arm with a strength that made her knuckles pale. She looked absolutely petrified. This was Isabella Moretti, the family ghost. Few people ever spoke of Dominic's mother. Some whispered she was unstable. Others claimed she was chronically ill. The majority of people assumed she had passed away long ago. She had disappeared from the public eye decades before. Dominic carefully guided her through the now silent restaurant. 4 bodyguards moved with them, their eyes sweeping every shadow, watching every person who moved too quickly. They arrived at table 1, the private booth hidden behind thick velvet curtains. Sophie stood 3 tables away, serving a couple who were bickering over a prenuptial agreement. She could feel the cold tension coming from that group. She watched Pierre, the lead waiter, perspire as he neared their table. Pierre was a proud Frenchman who was typically impossible to rattle. Tonight he looked like a condemned man on his final walk. "Good evening, Mr. Moretti," Pierre managed to say, his voice unsteady. "Madame, it is an honor to have you at the Onyx Room." Dominic paid him no attention. His world was focused on his mother. He gently pulled her chair out, helping her settle in with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his violent reputation. He straightened her shawl. He pushed a candle a few inches away from her hand. "Ma," Dominic murmured, his voice a low gravel. He leaned close to her. "Are you all right?" The old woman gave no response. She stared blankly at the pristine white tablecloth, her eyes distant and empty. She seemed lost, completely overwhelmed by the dim lighting and the dancing flame of the candle. "She is fine," Dominic said to no one in particular, though his jaw was clenched. He glanced at Pierre. "We require a moment. Get her water. No ice. Room temperature." "At once, monsieur." Sophie observed the scene from a safe distance. She could see the strain in Dominic's posture. It was not the alertness of a mob kingpin expecting an attack. It was the quiet agony of a son who felt like he was failing. She knew that expression well. She had seen it on her own face many times. 20 minutes went by. The unease in the restaurant had settled into a quiet thrum, but everyone was still glancing toward table 1. Something was clearly wrong. Pierre had approached the table on 3 separate occasions. Each time, he walked away looking more flustered and helpless. Mr. Halloway began to pace by the kitchen entrance, wringing his hands. Sophie was clearing a nearby table when she overheard the strained voices coming from the booth. "I told you to ask her what she would like." Dominic's voice was getting louder. It was not a full-blown yell, but it carried the deep rumble of an approaching storm. "I have attempted to, Mr. Moretti," Pierre stuttered. "I told her about our specials. I recommended the branzino. She does not acknowledge me." "She is not an idiot," Dominic shot back. "She is just—" He stopped himself, dragging a hand across his face. "Just bring the menu again. The one that has pictures. You have one with pictures, right?" "This is a Michelin-starred restaurant, monsieur," Pierre said, his professional pride momentarily overcoming his fear. "We do not offer picture menus." Dominic shot up from his seat. The chair legs screeched across the polished floor. The noise was as sharp as a gunshot. "Then you figure out what she wants to eat," Dominic snarled. "She has not eaten anything in 2 days. She is frightened. She is confused. And you are just standing there speaking a bunch of French words she cannot understand." "I am speaking English, sir." "She cannot hear you," Dominic thundered. The restaurant fell into a complete dead silence once more. Dominic stopped, as if surprised by his own outburst. He looked down at his mother. Isabella had not moved an inch. She was still fixated on the tablecloth, pulling at a single loose thread, completely isolated in her quiet world. She is deaf, Dominic stated, his voice now a low, menacing whisper. She lost her hearing 3 years ago. The hearing aids bother her skin. She refuses to wear them. She can read lips, but the lights in here are too dim. She is not able to see your mouth. Pierre was at a complete loss. I could bring a notepad. She has arthritis, Dominic spat. She cannot hold a pen for very long. Look at her hands. Isabella's hands were knotted, her fingers bent at painful angles. She glanced up at Dominic, her eyes filled with confusion. She let out a small, frustrated noise, the kind of guttural sound a deaf person might make trying to speak, without being able to hear their own voice. A few patrons nearby looked over, clearly uncomfortable. A woman in a red cocktail dress let out a nervous laugh. Dominic's head whipped around toward the sound. His eyes were pure ice. Did you find something amusing? He asked. The woman in red turned white. No, I just... Leave, Dominic commanded. I beg your pardon? Get out. The woman and her date quickly got up, abandoning their half-finished meals, and all but sprinted to the exit. Dominic turned his glare back to Pierre. I need someone who can speak to her, now. Find me an employee who knows sign language. American Sign Language. You have 50 people on your staff. Someone has to know it. Holloway, the manager, scurried over. Mr. Moretti, my deepest apologies. I am afraid we do not have anyone on our team with that specific qualification. I could act as an interpreter if we type on a tablet. She despises screens, Dominic said, his patience completely gone. She is convinced they are used to spy on her. I brought her to this place because she once loved it, 20 years ago. All he wanted was one decent dinner. He looked over at his mother. Isabella seemed on the verge of tears. She tapped the table, searching for water, but the glass was just beyond her grasp. This is pointless, Dominic said with finality. We are going. He started to pull back his mother's chair. This was the exact disaster Holloway had feared. If Moretti departed upset, the Onyx Room's reputation would be ruined. Vendors would cancel contracts. Inspectors would swarm the place. It would be shuttered in a month. Holloway frantically searched his staff's faces. Does anybody know sign language? A $5,000 bonus on the spot. The waitstaff studied their shoes. The cooks gestured no. Pierre stared at the ceiling. Sophie was standing near the water pitchers. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a bruise forming from the inside. She knew how. Her little brother Toby had been born without his hearing. For 10 years she was his voice in his ears, connecting him to the world before meningitis took him 2 years ago. Her hands still knew the movements. Her soul remembered the quiet. But stepping up to Dominic Moretti, a man who had ejected a couple for laughing too loud, was terrifying. A man people spoke of in hushed tones. Don't you dare, Sophie, her mind pleaded. Stay out of sight. She saw Dominic trying to help his mother get up. Isabella resisted, looking distressed and confused, as if she had done something wrong to cut the night short. She seemed so fragile. In her face, Sophie saw her own grandmother. In her struggle, she saw Toby. Her feet started moving before her brain could object. Sophie took one step forward, and then a second. Mr. Holloway, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Holloway whipped around. Bennett? What is it? Not now. Sophie swallowed hard. She held her serving tray like a shield. I think I can help. Dominic paused. He turned around slowly to look at her. Sophie felt his gaze like a physical pressure. It traveled from her worn-out shoes to the loose bun in her hair. He appeared doubtful, almost offended that this small, trembling waitress dared to speak. You? Dominic questioned. You know American Sign Language? Yes, sir, Sophie whispered. I am fluent. Dominic held her gaze for a long, painful moment. Then, he motioned toward the table. You have 2 minutes, he stated. If this is a waste of my time, you are finished in this town. Sophie gave a slight nod. She placed her tray on a nearby stand. Taking a deep breath, She straightened her apron. She walked right past a shocked Pierre and a horrified Holloway, entering the candlelit space of table 1. She kept her eyes off Dominic. She knelt by Isabella's chair. Kneeling was a serious violation of the rules. Servers always stood, but Sophie understood she had to be at eye level to be understood. Isabella jumped when Sophie appeared beside her. The older woman's eyes shot to Dominic with alarm. Sophie offered a smile. It was not a forced professional smile, but a gentle, real one. She lifted her hands. "Hello," Sophie signed. The motions were smooth, natural, and confident. "My name is Sophie. You look very lovely this evening." Isabella went still. Her eyes grew wide. The panic on her face was replaced by disbelief. Dominic stood by like a guard, his hand near the inside of his coat. Isabella hesitantly lifted her own stiff hands. Her signing was slow and uneven from arthritis. "You speak with your hands," Isabella signed in reply. "Yes," Sophie signed. "I will be your server. The food is wonderful here, but the chef is a grumpy man." Isabella blinked. Then, a small, miraculous smile appeared on her face. She let out a soft, unused laugh. "My son is also grumpy," Isabella signed, nodding toward Dominic. Sophie looked up at Dominic. He was staring, his mouth hanging slightly open. His gaze shifted from his mother's smiling face to Sophie's moving hands. "He loves you very deeply," Sophie signed to Isabella. "He wants this to be a wonderful dinner for you. What would you like to eat? Something easy to chew? Or something with a little spice?" Isabella's entire posture softened. The stiffness went out of her frame. She leaned closer to Sophie. "I would like the scallops. And wine, red wine. Do not tell him. He believes I should only drink water." Sophie chuckled quietly. She faced Dominic. "She would like the scallops, sir, and a glass of Pinot Noir. She also specifically asked that I not mention the wine to you." Dominic glanced at his mother. Isabella met his gaze with a look of playful defiance while clutching her napkin. For the very first time that evening, the hardness in Dominic's expression eased. He focused on Sophie, really focused on her. "She wants the wine?" he asked, his voice now much softer. "Yes, sir." "Bring her the entire bottle," Dominic ordered. Sophie looked back at Isabella and signed. "He says it is okay. You are in charge." Isabella beamed. She reached over and gently patted Sophie's cheek. Dominic slowly sat back down. His security detail visibly relaxed. Holloway leaned against a far wall, sighing in relief. "What did you say your name was?" Dominic asked. He looked directly into Sophie's eyes. "Sophie, sir. Sophie Bennett." "Sophie," he said again, as if tasting the name. "You are not going anywhere, Sophie. You will serve this table tonight. Only you. Tell Pierre to leave us." "Yes, sir." Sophie rose to her feet, her legs shaking. She had done it. She had made it through. But as she started for the kitchen, she saw Dominic studying her. He was no longer looking at her as a server. He was looking at her like she was a mystery he was determined to figure out. And that is when she noticed him. A man sitting at the bar, 3 seats away, watching everything in the mirror's reflection. He was not looking at Dominic. He was looking directly at her. When he realized she saw him, he tapped his nose twice. A chill went down Sophie's spine. It was their signal. Sophie escaped to the kitchen, her heart pounding a wild rhythm inside her chest. The heavy doors swung shut, cutting off the dining room's low hum and throwing her back into the clatter of pans and yells of cooks. But all the noise seemed far away, muted by the sound of her own pulse in her ears. Holloway rushed over, his face red with excitement. "You are a miracle worker! I saw them laughing. Laughing! The Moretti table is actually laughing. Do you have any idea what this means for us?" Sophie grabbed the steel countertop, her knuckles turning white. "I just need a moment, Mr. Holloway." "Take 5 minutes. Take 10 minutes. Help yourself to a dessert." Holloway was almost bouncing with joy. "Just get back out there and make sure the queen is happy. If tonight ends well, A big promotion is coming your way. Sophie just nodded, feeling numb, and ducked into the dry storage room, pulling the door shut. In the faint light, among sacks of flour and large cans of tomatoes, she let the fear wash over her. She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. The man at the bar. She recognized him. Not by name, but she knew his kind. He was Mick the Rat O'Shea. He was a low-level enforcer, a debt collector for the O'Hanlon crew, the Irish syndicate that ran the Southside docks. They were the entire reason her father skipped town 5 years ago, leaving Sophie and her ailing grandmother with a debt that only grew larger, no matter how many extra shifts she took. The tap on the nose was not a friendly gesture. It was a clear message. We see you. We know this job. We know your address. And now, the O'Hanlons saw her getting friendly with Dominic Moretti, the bitter rival of every other criminal organization in Chicago. To a man like Mick, this did not look like good service. This looked like Sophie was choosing a side. Breathe, she signed to herself in the darkness. Just breathe. She could not leave. If she did, they would show up at her grandmother's nursing home. She had to see the shift through. She had to act as if nothing was wrong. Sophie threw some cold water on her face from a utility sink, adjusted her apron, and stepped back out onto the dining room floor. As she neared table 1, the entire mood had transformed. The heavy, anxious silence was gone. Isabella was enjoying her scallops, her face alive as she signed quickly to Dominic. Dominic was leaning in, trying to follow his mother's hands with a focus that touched Sophie's heart. He was working so hard to connect, but he was only catching about half of it. Sophie moved back into the candlelight. Dominic glanced up, and for a brief moment, his tough exterior vanished. He actually looked happy to see her. She is telling me a story, Dominic said in a low voice. Something about a bird, a bluebird. Sophie watched Isabella's hands, and the blue jay snatched the ribbon from the porch railing. Your father laughed so much he spilled his morning coffee. It was a blue jay, Sophie translated quietly, as she poured more wine for Isabella. It took a ribbon from your porch. Your father thought it was so funny he spilled his coffee. Dominic's eyes widened in recognition. A small smile flickered across his face, a genuine smile this time. I remember that day. I was 6 years old. It was the ribbon from my birthday gift. He looked at his mother and gave a nod, awkwardly signing. I remember. Isabella clapped her hands together without a sound, the corners of her eyes crinkling. She looked at Sophie. He was such a messy child, Isabella signed. He always had dirt on his pants. Now he buys expensive suits and resembles a mortician. Sophie fought back a laugh. She translated. She says you were a messy kid, and she thinks you now dress like a funeral director. Dominic actually chuckled. It was a deep, rough sound, like an old engine finally starting up after sitting silent for years. The sound made people at other tables turn and look. The entire restaurant staff froze in place. A laugh escaped Dominic Moretti. Tell her this suit costs more than the building, Dominic said, his eyes locking onto Sophie's. A current crackled in the space between them. It was more than gratitude. It was the closeness of translation. Sophie was the link between his heart and his mother's thoughts. He controlled everything, except this silence. In that room, Sophie held all the power. So, Sophie, Dominic said, relaxing back and swirling his wine. Where did you learn? You mentioned you were fluent. My brother, Sophie answered softly. Toby. He was born deaf. Dominic noticed the past tense immediately. He passed away 2 years ago. Sympathy washed over Dominic's face. I am sorry. Truly. He would have liked you, Sophie lied. Toby would have been terrified of a man like Dominic. He admired men who protected their mothers. Dominic just stared at her. The air grew thin and electric. And you? Dominic asked. Who protects you, Sophie? The question was heavy, hanging in the silence. A cold chill traced its way up Sophie's spine. She glanced nervously toward the bar's entrance. The stool where Mick had been was now empty, but something was left on the bar counter. It was a cocktail napkin, held down by a cherry stem. "I can handle myself, sir," Sophie replied, her voice shaky. "I doubt that," Dominic murmured. He reached into his jacket and produced a business card. It was black, with only a gold phone number embossed on it. "If anyone gives you trouble, you call this direct line, 24 hours a day." He slid the card across the crisp white tablecloth. Sophie stared at it. Taking that card felt dangerous. It was like signing a contract, but refusing could be an insult. Isabella reached over and gently tapped Sophie's hand. "Take it. He is a bear, but a good one." Sophie accepted the card, slipping it into her apron pocket. "Thank you, Mr. Moretti." "Dominic," he corrected her. "Mr. Moretti was my father. He is the one who would have spilled the coffee." The evening was winding down. Isabella declined dessert but requested some tea. By the time they were leaving, the restaurant was nearly empty. Dominic rose and helped his mother with her heavy wool coat. Then he turned to Sophie. "Walk us out?" he asked. It was not really a request. Sophie escorted them to the valet stand. The brutal wind off Lake Michigan cut right through her thin uniform. His bodyguards moved into formation around them. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. Before she got in, Isabella gave Sophie a hug. It was a surprisingly fierce and bony embrace. "Thank you, little bird," she signed. Dominic waited by the open car door. The streetlights threw sharp shadows across his face. He noticed Sophie shivering in the biting cold. "You have a coat?" he asked her. "It is inside. I still have to finish my side work." "Right." He paused, as if he wanted to say more. The tip was included. "But this?" He pressed a thick fold of cash into her palm. "This is for the conversation. You gave me back my mother for a night. I do not forget favors, Sophie. It was my pleasure, Dominic." His gaze lingered for a moment too long before he nodded and got in the car. The heavy door thudded shut. The SUV sped off, swallowed by the Chicago night. Sophie stood there a moment, the cash clutched in her hand. She felt a warmth spreading through her despite the cold. Then she remembered the napkin. She hurried back inside, past the staff clearing tables, and went straight to the bar. The napkin was still there. She picked it up carefully. 3 words were scrawled in jagged red ink, likely from a swizzle stick. "The alley. Now." Sophie's stomach plummeted. She glanced toward the back exit. The alley was her only route to the staff lockers and her bus stop. She looked at the front door. It was locked. The manager had already lowered the security gate. The only way out was through the back. She was completely trapped. The alley behind the Onyx room was a narrow canyon of brick and steam. Dumpsters overflowed with the night's garbage along one wall. A single flickering bulb over the steel security door was the only light. Sophie stepped outside, pulling her coat tight against her throat. The cold air reeked of garbage and damp snow. She gripped her purse strap with both hands until her knuckles ached. "Hello?" she whispered into the darkness. There was nothing but the distant wail of a siren and water dripping from an air conditioner. She began to walk quickly, her head down, focused on the streetlight at the alley's end. Her footsteps echoed on the wet pavement. Click, clack, click, clack. Then, a shadow separated itself from the wall. Sophie gasped and whirled around. Mick O'Shea emerged into the dim light. He was a thin man with a sharp face and eyes like shattered glass. He wore a cheap leather jacket and chewed on a toothpick. Behind him, 2 larger men stepped out from behind the dumpsters. They were bigger and slower, dressed in hooded sweatshirts. "Mick," Sophie breathed out. "I do not have the money, not until the 1st of the month. You know the schedule." Mick just laughed, a dry, scratching sound. He moved closer, invading her personal space. She could smell old cigarettes and peppermint schnapps on his breath. "This is not about the money, sweetheart. Although that interest keeps piling up, Grandma's nursing home is not cheap, is it?" "Leave her out of this," Sophie said, her voice trembling. I am just a concerned citizen, Mick sneered. He reached out, touching the lapel of her coat. We saw you tonight with the butcher. Looked very cozy, lots of hand signals and smiles. I was only doing my job, Sophie stammered, backing away until she hit the cold brick wall. His mother is deaf. I was just translating, that is all. Mick slammed his hand on the wall right next to her head. Sophie flinched, a tiny cry escaping her. Do not you lie to me, Mick hissed. You were whispering to him. You were laughing. Moretti does not laugh. What did you tell him? Did you mention us? About your father's debt? No, I swear. We were only talking about food. Bull, Mick spat. He leaned in so close his nose almost touched hers. Here is how it is going to be, Sophie. You are in a special position. You are going to be our ears now. And since you are so good with your hands, you can use them to help us. What? What are you talking about? The next time he comes in, you listen. Find out where he is moving the shipment next Thursday. Find out who he is meeting. Mick grinned, showing his yellow teeth. And if you do not, well, old ladies have fragile bones. Accidents happen in nursing homes. A fall down the stairs, a slip in the bath. Sophie felt sick to her stomach. Please, I cannot. He would kill me. He might, Mick shrugged. But I definitely will. So you choose. The butcher or the rat? He reached into her coat pocket. Sophie froze. He pulled out the wad of cash Dominic had handed her. Consider this a down payment, Mick said as he pocketed the money. Now get out of here, and remember, we are watching. Mick started to walk away, his goons laughing behind him. Sophie slumped against the wall, hot tears streaming down her cheeks. She felt like she was going to be sick. She had lost the money. She was stuck between two warring mobs. And now her grandmother was a target. Hey, Mick, a voice called from the darkness. It was not Sophie's voice. It was deep, calm, and terrifyingly powerful. Mick froze solid. He turned slowly toward the alley's entrance. A figure was silhouetted against the streetlights. The red glow of a cigar lit up a sharp jawline. It was Dominic Moretti, and he was not alone. Two of his bodyguards, huge men in wool coats, were blocking the exit. Mr. Moretti, Mick stammered, his confidence vanishing instantly. We were just having a conversation with the girl. We are old family friends, and exhaled a thick plume of smoke. He walked forward, his steps heavy and deliberate. He stopped 3 feet from Mick, towering over him. She is a waitress, Mick, Dominic said casually. She serves pasta. She pours wine. She does not have friends like you. It is a misunderstanding, Mr. Moretti. Her father owed the O'Sheas. We are just collecting. Is that right? Dominic glanced past Mick to Sophie, who was huddled against the wall. She was shaking uncontrollably. For a split second, Dominic's eyes softened, then they turned to black ice as he looked back at Mick. She served my mother tonight, Dominic said softly. She made my mother smile. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Look, just take the money, Mick said, pulling the cash from his pocket and holding it out with a shaky hand. Keep it. We are good. Dominic glanced at the cash. Then he looked at Mick's hand. You touched her, Dominic stated. It was not a question. You put your hands in her pockets. Grab him. The command was almost a whisper. The two bodyguards moved with frightening speed. Before Mick could even scream, he was pinned against a dumpster. The other two thugs glanced at each other and ran, bolting past Dominic. Dominic did not even turn his head. He let them go. He only wanted the main rat. Dominic walked over to Mick. He removed the cigar from his mouth, inspecting its burning end. This is my city, Dominic said calmly. And the people inside this building, the staff, they belong to me too. You tax them, you tax me. You threaten them, you threaten me. I am sorry. I did not know, Mick squealed. You knew. Dominic took the cash from Mick's hand. He turned and walked back to Sophie. He knelt, ignoring the dirty slush soaking his expensive trousers. He held out the money. Are you hurt? He asked. Sophie just shook her head, her words gone. A violent tremble took hold of her, making her teeth chatter. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out completely. Dominic was there to catch her. His hold was solid and warm, filled with incredible strength. He lifted her with ease, holding her steady against his solid chest. She could smell expensive cologne, tobacco, and the faint metallic scent of gunpowder. I cannot be seen with you, Sophie whispered, a fresh wave of panic rising. They will kill her. My grandmother. Dominic looked down at her. No, they will not. He turned his attention back to Mick, who the guards still held. Listen to me very carefully, Mick. Dominic's voice cut through the wind. The dead is gone. The girl is untouchable. The grandmother is untouchable. If I hear even a whisper that they were harmed, if I hear she so much as tripped on a sidewalk, I will find you, and I will take away your hands so you can never again touch anything that belongs to me. Do you understand? Yes. Oh God, yes, Mick cried out. Put him in the dumpster, Dominic commanded. The guards threw Mick into the open container, where he landed with a wet thud and a yelp. Dominic then turned his full attention back to Sophie. He removed his heavy overcoat, draping it over her shoulders. It enveloped her, warm and heavy. My car is just around the corner, Dominic said. I am taking you home. I cannot, Sophie protested weakly. This will only make it worse. Sophie, Dominic said, gripping her by the shoulders. He made her meet his gaze. You are no longer invisible. You tried to be, but that is finished. You stepped into the light to help my mother. Now you are in my light, and nothing hurts what is in my light. He let the words sink in. Now, he said gently, where does your grandmother live? I need to send some men to watch the nursing home, just in case. Sophie looked up at him. She saw the violence he was capable of. She did. But she also saw the man who recalled a blue jay and a ribbon. She realized with a sudden, terrifying jolt that she had just exchanged a debt to a street punk for a debt to a king. Rogers Park, she whispered. She is at St. Jude's. Dominic nodded. He led her toward the end of the alley, his arm protectively around her back. Let us go, he said. You are quitting this job tomorrow. What? I cannot. I need the money. You are not going to be a waitress any longer, Sophie, Dominic stated, opening the door to his sport utility vehicle. My mother needs a companion, someone who can speak her language, and I need someone I can trust. He paused, his gaze dark and intense. And right now, you are the only person in Chicago who has not lied to me. The Moretti estate was located in Lake Forest, a sprawling masterpiece of limestone and wrought iron concealed behind a gate that looked like it could stop a tank. To the public, it was a historic landmark. To the criminal underworld, it was the fortress where Dominic Moretti decided the future of Chicago. For Sophie, it was a beautiful cage, but it was filled with a warmth she had never known. 2 weeks had passed since the night in the alley. Sophie had resigned from the Onyx Room the very next morning. Her grandmother, Rose, was moved into a private suite at St. Jude's, paid for by a shell corporation Sophie was certain led back to Dominic. The security team outside Rose's room was subtle but deadly. Sophie was staying in the guest wing of the Moretti mansion, a room larger than her entire apartment, with windows that looked out over the frozen lake. Her job was straightforward: be Isabella's voice, be her friend. Each morning, Sophie would sit with Isabella in the sunroom. They would drink tea, they would play chess, and they communicated. Sophie's hands flew, signing the news, the gossip from the household staff, and the memories that Isabella had locked inside her silence. Isabella was flourishing. The days that had troubled her at the restaurant was vanishing. With her ability to communicate restored, her sharp wit had returned. Isabella signed one Tuesday morning, as she watched Dominic through the glass doors of his study. He was pacing on the phone, His tie loosened, a scowl carved on his face. "He adores you," Sophie said out loud. Then she signed it. "He wants you to be safe." "Safety is dull," Isabella scoffed, her fingers moving fast. "I want grandchildren. I want noise. I want him to look at a woman the way he looks at you when he believes no one is watching." Sophie blushed and nearly dropped her teacup. "He does not look at me that way. I am deaf, little bird, not blind." Sophie glanced toward the study. Dominic had stopped his pacing. He looked up, and their eyes met through the glass. The scowl disappeared, replaced with a soft and almost unnoticeable nod. The connection between them felt like a taut wire buzzing with electricity. Later that evening, the reality of her new life crashed down on her. Dominic came into the library where Sophie was reading. He looked drained. There was a fresh bruise on his knuckles and a dark splatter on his cuff that he had tried to wash out. "How was she today?" Dominic asked, pouring a whiskey for himself. He did not offer her one. He knew she did not drink. "She is happy," Sophie said, putting a marker in her book. "She beat me in chess 2 times, and she wants to attend the opera gala on Saturday." Dominic went still. The glass halted halfway to his mouth. "The charity ball?" "Absolutely not." "She saw the invitation on your desk," Sophie said softly. "She has been talking about it all day. She says she has not worn her emeralds in 5 years. She wants to feel normal, Dominic." "It is not safe," Dominic said, his voice hard. "The O'Sheas have been quiet since the alley. Far too quiet. If I take her into a public place, it becomes a security nightmare." "She is your mother, not a prisoner," Sophie countered, surprising herself with her own courage. Dominic turned to face her, his eyes flashing. "Do you understand what happens if I make a mistake? Do you know what men like Mick O'Shea do to get leverage on someone like me? They do not come after me. They come after what I love." He stopped. The silence in the room was absolute. "What I love." He had not intended to say that. The unspoken meaning hung between them. He was referring to his mother, of course, but the way he looked at Sophie, intense, hungry, and terrified, implied the list of things he loved had expanded by one. Sophie stood and went over to him. She was not the shy waitress any longer. Living in this house, seeing the immense burden he carried, had made her brave. "She needs this," Sophie whispered. "And perhaps you do too. You cannot keep everyone locked in a glass box forever." Dominic looked down at her. He reached out with his rough hand, lightly brushing her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her lower lip. "If we go," he said, his voice raspy, "you must be right beside her. You do not leave her side. Not for 1 second. You are her ears. You are her guard." "I will not leave her," Sophie promised. "And Sophie." Dominic leaned in, his forehead coming to rest against hers. "If anything happens, if you see anything at all, you tell me. You do not try to be a hero. You run to me, I promise." He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, tasting of whiskey and fear, and a longing so deep it was like drowning. When he pulled back, he looked like a man who had just sealed his own fate. "Get a dress," he said roughly, turning away so she could not see his face. "Something expensive." "We are going to the opera." The Chicago Lyric Opera House was a vast cavern of gold leaf and red velvet, humming with the energy of the city's elite. Senators mingled with tech billionaires, and crime lords in tuxedos clinked glasses with judges. It was the single night of the year when the lines of legality blurred in the name of charity. Sophie wore a midnight blue silk gown with long sleeves and an open back that Isabella had picked out. She felt beautiful, but also incredibly exposed. She stayed glued to Isabella's side, her eyes scanning the room, her hands ready to translate. Dominic was like a statue in a tuxedo. He moved through the crowd with a deadly grace, shaking hands, smiling tightly, but his eyes never stopped moving. His most trusted lieutenants were spread out along the perimeter, with hidden earpieces. Isabella was radiant. She held court, smiling as people came to her, waiting for Sophie to translate their compliments into sign language. "They are all snakes," Isabella signed discreetly, a polite smile fixed on her face. "That man in the gray suit, he owes Dominic $2 million. Sophie held back a laugh. "He says you look lovely, Mrs. Moretti." Everything seemed perfectly fine until intermission. The crowd began to move toward the grand staircase for champagne. The volume in the room rose, a chaotic mix of laughter, clinking glasses, and the sound of the orchestra tuning. Sophie felt a tingling on the back of her neck. She scanned the mezzanine level. A group of waiters was moving through the crowd carrying trays. One of them, a tall man with a scar over his lip, was not watching his tray. He was staring at Dominic. Sophie watched him closely. She knew the rhythm of good service. She knew how a waiter was supposed to move. This man moved like a soldier. He raised a hand as if to scratch his ear. Then he tapped his nose. Sophie's blood ran cold. The signal, it was the same one Mick had used at the Onyx room. She looked across the balcony. Another waiter, standing near the entrance to a private box, tapped his nose in reply. It was not just a signal, it was a countdown. Sophie looked at Dominic. He was 10 feet away, trapped in a conversation with the mayor. The noise of the crowd was deafening. If she screamed, he might not hear her, or even worse, the shooters might panic and open fire into the crowd. Isabella was right beside her. She had to warn him, but she could not make a sound. Sophie stepped into Dominic's line of sight. She did not wave. She did not scream. She simply raised her hands to. Her gaze was locked on his, her face calm, but her throat tight. Dominic saw her and stopped talking immediately. "Trap," Sophie signed, her motions quick and military sharp. 3 men, posing as waiters, north balcony, west exit, armed. Dominic stayed perfectly still. He did not glance at the balcony. He kept his calm composure, smiling at the mayor. "Mr. Mayor, please excuse me," Dominic said with ease. "I think my mother could use some fresh air." As he turned, his hand moved to his lower back. He tapped his earpiece twice in a distinct pattern. "Code Black," he murmured. "Mezzanine, the staff." Then, everything erupted. The fake waiter on the balcony knew he'd been spotted. He drew a silenced pistol from his jacket. "Down!" Dominic yelled, pushing the mayor down and shoving Isabella at Sophie. Sophie grabbed Isabella, hiding her behind a marble column. Right as the marble exploded from a spray of bullets, screams filled the air. The ballroom descended into chaos. People scrambled for the exits, trampling one another. Dominic was already firing back with precise movements. His security team moved in, forming a protective wall of bodies and armor around the pillar. "Get them out of here," Dominic ordered his head of security, Luca. "Use the service elevator." "Dominic!" Sophie screamed, holding Isabella tight. "Go," Dominic said, his eyes intense. "I am right behind you. Just go." Luca took Sophie and Isabella, guiding them quickly through a side door into the kitchen hallways. The noise of gunfire followed them, loud and terrifying. They ran down the corridor. Isabella was struggling to breathe, one hand on her chest, but she kept running. They got to the service elevator. Luca hit the button hard. The doors creaked open. "Inside," Luca commanded. Sophie pushed Isabella in, but just as she was about to step in herself, a heavy metal fire door crashed down, sealing the hallway from the elevator area set off by the fire alarm. Luca and Isabella were on the elevator side. Sophie was trapped on the other. "Sophie!" Isabella cried out, her voice muffled as she pounded on the closing elevator doors. "Go!" Sophie shouted back. "Get her downstairs." The elevator doors closed. Sophie stood alone in the hall. She could hear the sound of heavy boots running on the tile floor. She looked. At the far end of the hall, the fake waiter with the scar stood. A wound on his shoulder was bleeding, and his face was a mask of rage. He spotted Sophie. "You!" he sneered, The little sign language girl. He lifted his gun. Sophie stumbled backward, her feet sliding on the slick floor. There was nowhere to run. The fire door was sealed. She shut her eyes, bracing for the gunshot. Bang! The sound was deafening, yet Sophie felt nothing. She opened her eyes to see the assassin on the ground, a neat hole in his forehead. Dominic stood over him, smoke rising from the barrel of his silver Desert Eagle. He looked a mess, his tie was gone, and his shirt was splattered with someone else's blood. He stepped over the dead man, his eyes focused completely on Sophie. He said nothing. He closed the gap in 2 long steps and pulled her into a fierce hug, holding her tightly against him. He was trembling. The powerful king of Chicago was actually shaking. "I told you," he whispered into her neck, taking in her scent. "I told you to stay with her." "The door!" Sophie cried, gripping his ruined shirt. The fire door just fell. "I couldn't get through." "It is okay," Dominic murmured, kissing her hair, her forehead, and her tears. "You saved all of us. You saved everyone. I saw your hands. I saw them." He drew back, holding her face in his hands. "You spoke to me right in the middle of all that chaos. Nobody else could ever do that." "Is she okay?" Sophie asked. "Luca is on the radio." "She is in the car. She is safe." Dominic's thumb gently brushed her cheek. "But we need to leave. The Oanians." This was a desperate last resort for them. He grasped her hand. "Can you run?" "Yes." "Then run with me. And do not let go." The war that came after was over in 3 days. It was fast, vicious, and fought out of sight. With the botched assassination at the opera, the Oanian family had shown their weakness. They put civilians and politicians at risk, breaking the city's unspoken code. Dominic barely had to lift a finger. The other families, shocked by the carelessness and worried about the attention from the shooting, turned against the Oanians. Mikosha's body was discovered in a car trunk at O'Hare Airport. The Oanian family leaders escaped to Ireland, vowing never to come back. On the 4th day, Chicago was quiet again. But it was a new kind of quiet. It was the quiet of settled peace. Sophie sat on the terrace of the Lake Forest estate, a cashmere blanket around her. The winter sun shone brightly on the snow. She was watching Isabella teach Dominic sign language. They were on a bench near the garden. Isabella was laughing as she fixed Dominic's awkward finger positions. "No, do it like this," Isabella signed. "Your thumb needs to be out." "You are signing donkey instead of stubborn." Dominic frowned and moved his hand. "Is this better?" Isabella signed. "But you are still a donkey." Sophie smiled and carried the tray of espresso to them. Dominic looked up at her. The bruises on his face were starting to heal. He reached up and took the tray from her and placed it on the stone table. Then he gently took her hand. "Sit down," he said. Sophie sat. Isabella watched them with a knowing look in her eyes. She picked up her espresso and casually turned her chair to face the lake, allowing them some privacy. "The police released their report today," Dominic said softly. "They are calling it a gang-related incident. No names were released. You are in the clear, Sophie. You can return to your apartment. You can have your old life back. Your grandmother's medical bills have been paid for the next 10 years. You are free." Sophie felt her stomach drop. "Are you letting me go?" Dominic stared out at the lake. "I am giving you a way out. This kind of life, you saw what it was like at the opera. It is full of danger. It is ugly. You are too good for this darkness, Sophie." He released her hand. The feeling was like a physical strike. "I can get a car to take you to Rogers Park in the next hour." Sophie just looked at him. She could see the hurt in his eyes. He was trying to keep her safe in the only way he understood, by making her leave. He was scared that the next time, a bullet might not miss. She looked over at Isabella, who was watching a red bird in the snow. She looked at the big house, a fortress that had somehow turned into a home. Sophie got to her feet. Dominic flinched, thinking she was about to leave. Instead, she walked right up to him. She stood there until he met her gaze. Then she lifted her hands. I was invisible for 23 years, she signed with care. I was a phantom in a restaurant. I was a phantom in my own life. Dominic watched her hands, completely captivated. He understood everything she signed. He had been learning. You were the one who saw me, she went on. You gave me my voice. If I return to that apartment, I will just be invisible once more. I do not want to be safe, Dominic. I want to be seen. She put her hands down and spoke, her voice clear and firm. I am not leaving here unless you do not want me here. Dominic slowly rose to his feet. He looked at this woman, the quiet, timid waitress who entered a dangerous world and calmed the beasts with just her silence. I want you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I want you more than I want to take my next breath. Then you need to stop trying to get rid of me. Dominic took a small velvet box out of his pocket. He glanced at it and then at her. I was planning to wait, he confessed, maybe 6 months, maybe a year to do this the right way. But I nearly lost you back in that hallway, and I am done wasting time. He opened the box. A vintage ring with an emerald surrounded by diamonds rested inside. It was Isabella's ring, the one she had not worn for years. My mother gave this to me just this morning, Dominic explained. She told me if I allowed you to leave, she would cut me off completely. Sophie gasped, her hands covering her mouth. Sophie Bennett, Dominic said, as he lowered himself to one knee in the snow. Will you be my voice? Will you be my heart? Will you marry me? Sophie glanced at Isabella. The older woman had turned back around. She was smiling from ear to ear and gave Sophie 2 thumbs up. Sophie looked back at Dominic. The King of Chicago was on his knees before her, awaiting her answer. She did not speak. She did not sign. She simply knelt in the snow with him and gave him a kiss. And in the quiet of that winter garden, with only a deaf mother and a small bird as witnesses, the quiet waitress became a queen. The incident at the Onyx Room had ignited a war. But the silence, their silence, had started a life. And that is the story of how Sophie Bennett went from serving water to running an empire. It was never about the weapons, or the wealth, or the control. It was about the one thing Dominic Moretti could never buy, someone who could truly understand him. In a world filled with constant noise, Sophie was the only one who really knew how to listen. If you enjoyed this story of risk, romance, and the power of being heard, please go ahead and hit that like button. It is a huge help to the channel. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you will always know when a new story is up. What would you have chosen to do in the alley? Would you have taken the money? Or would you have called Dominic? Tell me what you think in the comments section below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.